and we will be able to proceed further with this very important issue, as I said, which is from a great public concern, although aspartame is with well-established use since 1965, I think. But the recent studies are bringing some concern to public, and there are many questions from different NGOs and from citizens which are referring to us and asking whether we could provide them with more data. So immediately I will start with presenting our first speaker. This is Dr. Morando Sofriti, Scientific Director of the Ramazzini Center. And he will do a summary of the cancerogenic studies undertaken by the Ramazzini Center in Bologna. And this is actually the first study that has been brought publicly with some concern about the effects of aspartame. Floor is yours, Dr. Sofriti.
Microphone, please. Thank you.
Thank you for the kind invitation. First, let me introduce myself. I am the scientific director of the Ramazzini Institute and the Secretary General of the Collegium Ramazzini, an international academy of 182 members. Ramazzini Institute is an independent scientific institute working on industrial carcinogenesis since more than 40 years, and it discovered the carcinogenicity of vinyl chloride, benzene, formaldehyde, and so is very much involved in product of wide consumption and exposure of people all around the world. The information I will provide today is an synopsis, summary of what we have done on aspartame. Next. Few information, being the first speaker of this meeting, few information about aspartame. It's produced on more than 18,000 tons a year. It's the second artificial intense sweetening agent after saccharin. 62% of the intense sweetening agents market, present in more than 6,000 products and noticeable on more than 500 drugs, mainly used for pediatrician drugs. Is supposed to be exposed to aspartame hundreds of millions of people in the world. Average daily intake in US and Europe is projected maximum consumption 22 to 34 milligram per kilogram body weight. In general population, 2-3 milligram per kilogram body weight, and children and women of childbearing age are more or less eating 2.5 milligram per kilogram body weight of aspartame. Next. To give an example of possible daily consumption of aspartame, dealing with 1 gram of aspartame, if you consume 2 cans of Diet Coke, 2 yogurts a day, different type of junky food, 4 cups of coffee, and so you may assume 1 gram of aspartame, which is more or less 45 milligram per kilogram body weight of a child of 20 kilogram, or 15 milligram per kilogram body weight for a woman of 60 kilogram. So this is important to keep in mind, because the doses we tested aspartame is not the lowest dose we tested aspartame, is not too far from this type of potential exposure. Next one. It is well known that aspartame is not genotoxic in several tests in vitro and in vivo. Next. This is the chemical formula in which aspartame is metabolized to phenylalanine, aspartic acid, and methanol. It is important to note that aspartame is not circulating in the blood but after being metabolized in the intestinal tract, it is what is circulating in the blood are aspartic acid, phenylalanine, and methanol, and in particular, methanol is metabolized to formaldehyde in the liver. And this is important for to take in consideration for the result of our experiment conducted on mice. Next one. The available test of carcinogenic test on aspartame were performed by industry in 1973, 74, and 81, and the regulatory by Food and Drug Administration, the EFSA, on carcinogenicity are based on this experiment performed in the early 70s. It is important to note that because in the early 80s, Food and Drug Administration, Environmental Protection Agency, ACOD in Europe established the good laboratory practice because experiments performed before, in particular by industry, were considered in several times, in several occasions, to have some mess, just to use an euphemism. Next one. All these experiments performed by industry in that years were negative, both in mice and rats. Next one. What were the motivation for us to perform studies on aspartame? First, the limited sensitivity of the study performed by industry, based on small number of animals per group, 40 per groups, per sex, duration of the observation, 110 weeks, 110 weeks, which is the 2/3 of the life of mice and rats. The fact that before we showed in our institute, in our laboratory, we showed the carcinogenicity of methanol and formaldehyde, which are metabolites of aspartame. And given also the ever-growing use of aspartame throughout the years. The Ramazzini Foundation, now Ramazzini Institute, decided in the late 90s to plan an integrated project that would finally provide an adequate evaluation of the potential carcinogenic effect of aspartame based on the total number of animals we used, based on the dose levels we studied, and also the lifespan duration of our experiment, and the conduct of the experiment according to GLP, which it was not the conduct of the experiment of industry conducted in the 70s. Next one. The Ramazzini project encompassed, next one, up to now, almost 4,000 rats. The first experiment on 1800 rats has been published in 2005. The second experiment for under 70 rats published in 2007. And we have ongoing 2 more experiments on rats of almost 1,000 rats. And the 4th experiment is on mice, performed on more than 800 mice, which I'm talking today. Next. So all the experiments were conducted substantially following the good laboratory practice. The aspartame was the technical product used in the common products. We measured all the time of the experiment water and food consumption, body weight, clinical control. We performed complete necropsy, histopathological evaluation, which it was in the first experiment on more than 30,000 slides. We made a statistical evaluation as follows. Next one. Here, briefly, the result. In the first experiment performed on 1,800 males and females, treated from 6 weeks of age until death, 7 dose levels per groups, 5,000, 2,500, and so until 20 milligram per kilogram body weight, the last in which we found a carcinogenic effect. And the result were significant increase dose-related lymphoma and leukemia and benign neoplastic lesion of the kidney in females, and significant increase dose-related of malignant schwannomas of cranial peripheral nerves in males. In the second experiment, we observed an statistical increased incidence of lymphoma and leukemias and mammary cancer in females, and lymphoma leukemias also in males. Next one. Here you can see that exposing animal from prenatal time until spontaneous death, the incidence of lymphoma and leukemias are higher, and also the lymphoma and leukemia arise earlier than comparing when you expose animal from 6 weeks of age, which is a juvenile age period of time of life. Next. So the experiment on Swiss mice. The experiment on Swiss mice has been performed on more than 400 males and 400 females, and at different dose levels. Next one. What we have found, we didn't find differences in the total malignant tumors in treated animal compared to the control. Next. We found, instead, statistical increased incidence in male mice of adenocarcinomas of the lung, 13% compared to 6% in the control, and with a dose relationship, dose level relationship. Next one. Here you can see badly that increasing incidence in the treated animal compared to the control. Control is the white curve. Interesting in this slide is also to see that in the control at the 120 weeks of age, we don't observe any more lung carcinoma. Next one. Here we observed in males increased statistically significant increase of hepatocarcinoma, 18% compared to 5% in the control, which means 3 times increase of this type of tumors. I must note that in this case, as in lung carcinomas, the statistical increased incidence is in the range also of our historical control, but not in overall historical overall means of historical control. And a part of that, everybody recognizes definitely that the most important data is produced by the concurrent control instead the historical controls. Next one. Here again you can see that the increased incidence of the treated animal compared to the control. Next. Another information which is shown is dealing with hemangiocarcinomas of the liver, in which, if not statistically significant, is still increased. Next one. So at the end of our project up to now, we have shown that aspartame is carcinogenic in 2 species of rodent, rat and mice, both in males and females, and for some of them it has been reproduced in 2 studies in rats. Next one. So concluding remarks about at the moment about aspartame project. In our experimental condition, aspartame has been shown to induce significantly increased incidence of malignant tumors in multiple tissues, in male and female, multiple tissue in male mice, an earlier occurrence in treated animals, an higher incidence, and anticipated onset of cancer when treatment starts from fetal life. Next one. Given that aspartame is completely metabolized to GI tract, it may be concluded that the carcinogenicity effects were caused not by itself, but rather by its metabolites. The role of methanol inducing malignant neoplasm is reinforced by the following consideration based on experiment performed in our laboratory under the same experimental condition. Methanol, which is metabolized to formaldehyde in humans and rats, induce in female Sprague-Dawley rats significant increase of hematopoietic neoplasm. In male mice, it cannot be disregarded that conversion of aspartame methanol into formaldehyde adducts in liver cells may result in a progressive accumulation of adducts, which could explain the plausibility of the hepatocarcinogenic effects of aspartame. Next. Secondly, we have shown that MTBE, which is metabolized to methanol, induced in female Sprague-Dawley rats a significant increase of hematolymphopoietic neoplasm. Finally, formaldehyde, which is a metabolite also of methanol, induced in both male and female Sprague-Dawley rats a significant increase in hematopoietic neoplasm. Next. So there is a criticism and support of our data. Supporting our data was a letter from 13 scientists from US Academy and Agency to FDA Commissioner in 2007, an editorial to International Journal of Occupational Environmental Health in 2007, a commentary on environmental health perspective in 2008 by James Huff, a letter to cancer epidemiological biomarkers in 2008 by Deborah Davis, and so. Next. Different opinion from consultant of industry were from other criticism from other authors, and among them scientific opinion of EFSA and Food and Drug Administration. Next. General comment, absolute certainty in science is rarely an option. Uncertainty is not a norm, and the exception of scientists based on judgment are weight of evidence. Next one. On the basis of the weight of evidence of our result, aspartame should be considered a multiple-site, trans-species carcinogenic agent in rodents. A re-evaluation of the current regulation of aspartame remains, in our opinion, urgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the very scientific way you did your presentation, but not everybody here is from the scientific world, so it's difficult to digest. I hope that all this data is available on your website and by request, all the conclusions. Because we are short in time, very quickly, again, our second panelist is Dr. Thor Haldorsson, University of Iceland and Statens Serum Institute, Copenhagen, Denmark. The presentation will be on the artificial sweeteners, summary of the most recent data for pregnant women. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me here to talk about this study. My name is Thor Haldorsson, and I'm a senior researcher at the Center for Fetal Programming at the State Serum Institute in Copenhagen. I'm currently sitting at the University of Iceland, that's why the second affiliation is there. So I would like to my presentation to stick to this study on pregnant women and what we observed, and concerning the background to this study. We were aware of when the papers came out from the Sofriti group in 2005 and 2007, and we were sitting on this big database on pregnant women. In my group, we are looking at dietary intake during pregnancy and how it affects the fetal outcomes and maternal infant health. And when we did a quick literature search on PubMed, looking for peer-reviewed publications on diet soft drinks in pregnancy, or aspartame plus pregnancy, or asulfam K in pregnancy, you get very, very, very few hits. None of the papers actually has nothing to do with what you are searching for. But on the other hand, if you take the classical things that we're looking at, the detrimental effect of dioxin exposure during pregnancy, or fish oil, which everybody is in love with, and antioxidants, you get a huge amount of papers, and people have been looking at that extensively. So at least there hasn't
could you
in the peer
slow
review.
down, because we have problems with the translation.
Yeah. So at least doing this type of search, you see there's I wouldn't say a knowledge gap, but there's a interest, not much, there hasn't been much interest in examining this field. But if you go on the World Wide Web and Google the same, so to use the same search again, you will get almost an opposite results, where there appears to be a lot of interest in the general public about artificial sweeteners and their potential health benefits or detrimental effects, depending on which side you're on. And given the ever-increasing use of sweeteners, especially targeted towards children, and so there's an increase in sales, there's an increased sort of, what you can say, consumption over time, and if this is not followed by observational and experimental studies, that's quite natural that people are quarreling all the time about this issue. So I think it doesn't matter really if you sort of think that it's completely safe, like some of the regulatory agencies, sort of based on their opinion, or if you're on the other side and think it might be actually detrimental. There's sort of, in our opinion, there's a general lack of studies. Now, we were working with preterm delivery at the time that we did the study. That was one of the outcomes that we were looking at at the time. And we knew that intake of soft drinks had been, both sugar sweetened and artificially sweetened, had been linked with hypertensive disorders and individual attributes of the metabolic syndrome in middle-aged non-pregnant subjects. And hypertensive disorders are on their own an independent risk factor for preterm delivery. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be a causal link, but at least there was some ground for actually examining this outcome. Now, the data that we're working with is the Danish National Birth Cohort, which is a large nationwide study where approximately 35% of all pregnant women in Denmark between 1997 and 2002 were enrolled. There were different sources of information. We had information on dietary intake in mid-pregnancy for about 70% of the women, and they reported frequency of carbonated and non-carbonated sugar sweetened and artificially sweetened soft drinks in week 25 of gestation. Now, we ended up with a set of 59,334 women with singleton pregnancies. Preterm delivery was defined as delivery before week 37 of gestation, and the overall prevalence in our study population was 4.6%. That is slightly lower than the population average, because you tend to oversample healthy, enthusiastic women of high socioeconomic status. So that's why we have this low prevalence there. Now, we are aware of the fact that when you're looking at something like soft drink consumption that is associated with attributes of unhealthy lifestyle and low socioeconomic status, you might end up with sort of observing an adverse effect when there actually is none, because sort of due to residual confounding. It's the same thing when you're looking at vegetable intake or fish oil intake in pregnancy. You tend to get more favorable hits than there truly are if you don't adjust properly for confounding. So people have to be aware of that type of sort of bias. Now, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of my co-authors. It was done, so we were 4 in this group that sort of conducted the study. But if you just go quickly through the results, I thought I would be able to stand and sort of point somewhere. So this is a horrible table to look at. But basically what we see is that with increasing consumption of sugar-sweetened carbonated soft drinks, there was absolutely no increase in risk of preterm delivery. But when we looked at artificially sweetened carbonated soft drinks, there was a dose response increase in risk of preterm delivery, where women consuming 1 serving and up to 4 serving per day compared to those who did not consume these type of products had an sort of increased risk of between 30% to 80%. Now, it has to be kept in mind that preterm delivery is a rare outcome. So when you're looking at something that is a rare outcome, we are seeing an increase in prevalence from 4.4 and up to about 6 to 8%. So it's not like everybody is having a preterm delivery, it's a slight increase in risk. Now, one of the strengths of our study, I think, is that the results were very, very stable with respect to pre-pregnancy body mass index. So we would, sort of initially, we expected that we might pick something up simply because overweight women might tend to drink artificially sweetened soft drinks, and you would see an association there. But we almost get the same estimate for normal weight women and overweight women. There's always a problem with the underweight women because what they report eating is not always what they actually do eat. Now, the major weakness of the study, or a weakness of the study, is that our findings are primarily driven by medically induced preterm deliveries. And even though you can sort of debate whether splitting a very rare outcome into two even more rare outcomes with how it affects statistical stability, it's still quite clear that these preterm the association between artificially sweetened soft drinks and preterm delivery was driven by medically induced deliveries. So just to summarize our result, for carbonated soft drink, there was approximately a 38% increase in risk among women who consumed 1 serving a day or more compared to those with no intake. There was also a significant increase in risk for women consuming non-carbonated artificially sweetened soft drinks, although the increase in risk was lower. But still you have two variables going in the same direction, and there are different sweeteners used in these two types of products, so there might be some reason for this difference in risk. Now, overall, there was no association between sugar-sweetened carbonated and non-carbonated soft drinks. Sorry about the speed which I'm talking. Now, the results were, like I said, stable with respect to pre-pregnancy body mass index, and we saw no strong indication of confounding by attributes of lifestyle or socioeconomic status, but as I say again, it was driven by medically induced preterm deliveries, and this may on its own suggest that the association that we are observing is simply a iatrogenic phenomenon. That is, there's an underlying disease or a pattern that is simply driving this association. And acknowledging that, we looked at a range of potential disturbing factors. We examined women with pregnancy hypertension, we looked at preeclampsia, we looked at women with gestational diabetes, and even within that group there was a significant increase in risk with artificially sweetened soft drink consumption. We looked at maternal weight gain, high birth weight infants or macrosomia, use of various types of medication and intake of alcohol. And of course we are dealing with self-reported measures in many cases and sometimes with clinical records. So the error structures differ, and we can't say for sure, but we saw no strong indication here. Still we stick to, this might still be a iatrogenic phenomenon, of course. The other limitation is that we are not looking at one sweetener. When you study consumption of artificially sweetened soft drinks, you're looking at a mixture of sweeteners. And even though this graph looks complex, where you have 56 soft drink brands on the Danish market in 2005, and the different colors show different sweeteners used in each type of soft drink, the main international brands, they usually just use a blend of asulfam K and aspartame. So on the average exposure might be tilted towards that. Now, this type of what we can say approximation for exposure is used all the time in nutritional epidemiology. I mean, there are plenty of results, studies reporting an association between processed meat and certain types of cancer, and a processed meat is a mixture of different types of meats and different types of food additives. So this is just the limitation that you have to deal with in observational setting. With respect to possible explanation to our findings, people have been quarreling awful lot about this dietary methanol exposure from aspartame, if it really does matter, this low amount of methanol that you get from aspartame compared to other foods. And there's quite a lot of, you can almost pick the argument that you basically like and see the reference to that. But even if you refer to some of the aspartame-sponsored papers, there appears to be about 3- to 9-fold increase in dietary methanol exposure if people consume aspartame-sweetened foods on average, or regularly. And take any nutrient, beneficial nutrient, for example, like retinol, and if you, on average, increase the population exposure by factor 3 to 9, you would have some nutritionists would be very, very concerned that you might exceed the upper limit, even though the upper limit is very high. So it's still a ground to ask the question: is increasing the average exposures to dietary methanol, is that a beneficial step? And there was this one paper on chronic methanol exposures in non-human primates, looking at reproductive performances and birth outcomes. And they were looking at cognitive development, mostly, exposing the primates through inhalation at very low doses and up to high doses. They did observe some adverse effects on cognitive performance, but they were mostly going to look at latent effects later, but those results have not been published yet. But what they found, sort of what was maybe a sort of chance finding, or what they were not looking at, is that all the exposed animals had significant shortening of gestations. Some of them were delivered by C-sections, while no of the control animals were delivered by cesarean section. But we should not read too much into that. It might be due to chance or anything. But still, there's a link between dietary methanol exposure and preterm delivery, which can be hypothesized, and that's what we do in our study. Now, what we acknowledge is that even though we say that intake of artificially sweetened soft drinks may increase risk of preterm delivery, possibly due to low-dose methanol exposure, we are fully aware of the limitation of observational studies, and we are not like in a situation like Sofriti and his colleagues with 3 studies more or less going all in the same direction. We have just 1 observational paper. And in order to do this properly and sort of, examine the ever-increasing use of sweeteners, and if they are completely neutral or there are some groups that should avoid them, we need to do this properly and encourage people to look at the data and interpret them very, very carefully. And if given the patience, we will see if this will get replicated or not, and that's simply what we have to wait and see, because we are working with observational data, and it's very, I mean, observational data is in many cases the only way to properly look at things if you acknowledge the limitations. So that's basically what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Kenningswold, who is head of unit Food Additives and Nutrition Sources Added to Food in EFSA.
Thank you, Mrs. Chair. Well, we welcome the opportunity to present to the members of Parliament present here and to the general public the conclusions of our statement we published on the 28th February of this year. And, well, to quickly introduce myself, I'm responsible for the unit supporting the scientific panel on food additives and nutrient sources added to food of the European Food Safety Authority. And I would like to now present a bit the background of this work. First of all, just to give some ideas of the previous European evaluations of aspartame. It was first evaluated in Europe by the former Scientific Committee for Food, the SCF, in 1984. And this was the original evaluation of aspartame in Europe that established the ADI of 40 milligram per kilogram body weight per day. Then, to take into consideration new studies on potential behavioral and neurotoxic effects, the SCF made a new opinion in 1988. It was again the same in 1997, following a publication of an epidemiological study by ALDE and ALDE. Again, in 2002, the SCF updated the previous SCF opinions, and then EFSA was born in 2003 and took over. And so in 2006, the former AFC panel of EFSA has evaluated the first study by Dr. Sofriti and his colleagues on carcinogenicity study in rats exposed to aspartame. And again, in 2009, there was, from the current ANS panel, another opinion on the second study. Now, last year, there was a report by national experts following a long preparatory work and a comprehensive review of including the new scientific literature and the data submitted in response to a public call for data. So overall, there has been a very comprehensive evaluation of aspartame, and it's been periodically reviewed when new data, new scientific data arrives. Then about the recent activities by EFSA. So we received a request from the European Commission for technical and scientific assistance on 1st of February 2011 to undertake a scientific evaluation of studies presented in the 2 papers that have been presented by the authors today, and to indicate whether these studies should trigger a revision of the existing opinions on aspartame and other sweeteners. First of all, on 3rd of February, the ANS panel has adopted a preliminary scientific statement to advise EFSA on further work on these 2 studies. And then on 28th of February, there was a publication of the EFSA statement on these 2 studies. Now, to come to our conclusions on these 2 studies. First of all, on the study by Dr. Safriti and al. It's a carcinogenicity study in Swiss mice exposed to aspartame. We concluded that the validity of the study could not be assessed based on the information available. We had no information in the papers on precise objectives, specific hypotheses to be tested, outcome variables, also insufficient information on how the randomization, blinding, and allocation ratio were organized. The relevance of its statistical analysis could not be assessed also because in the paper, that's not uncommon in publications, but we lacked a detailed description of the statistical methods that have been used and the absence of description of a specific hypothesis tested. But we could, however, conclude to some extent because the tumors that were observed by the authors in Swiss mice are not relevant for human risk assessment. Mainly because the hepatic tumors, when they are induced by non-genotoxic compounds such as aspartame, are generally recognized in the scientific community as not relevant to human risk assessment, and also because there was a high spontaneous incidence of hepatic and pulmonary tumors in Swiss mice, and this is also very well known. Now, we also made some conclusion on the Haldorsen and al. Study. It's an epidemiological study on the association between maternal soft drink consumption and preterm delivery. And as Dr. Haldorsen has indicated himself in the paper and also in his presentation, it's an exploratory study. It's the first study, and it's to explore, really. It cannot establish a cause-effect relationship, and further studies are needed to confirm or reject the findings. Also, as acknowledged by Dr. Haldorsen today, an important thing is to see that the association that has been observed is mainly driven by medically induced preterm deliveries, and this, of course, would need to be further investigated. Also, Dr. Haldorsen said it himself, the association observed cannot be ascribed to any specific sweetener. And in further study, the confounding factors should certainly be investigated. Overall, on the basis of this conclusion on these 2 studies, we came to the conclusion that these 2 publications do not provide sufficient scientific evidence to give reason to reconsider the previous evaluation of aspartame or other sweeteners authorized in Europe. Now, there are also other activities that are ongoing on this in EU member states and also at the international level. We liaise with the national risk assessors in the member states through our advisory forum. And we have noticed that yesterday, the French Food Safety Agency, ANSES, has published an opinion on these 2 papers, and with conclusions that are, in essence, similar to those of the EFSA statement of the 28th of February. And we also liaise with food agency throughout the world. And I would like to also conclude my presentation with a presentation of the ongoing EFSA activities, because it's important to note that, as has been the case in the past, the story is not finished, the case is not closed. We are going on. We are, of course, considering very seriously any new scientific evidence. And first of all, the ANS panel will undertake further work on the interpretation of the results of the study by Dr. Sofriti and collaborators, and will also consider the suggested implications of methanol in both studies. And it's foreseen for the time being that this opinion could be finalized by the end of this year. In addition, we will meet Dr. Sofriti next week, and we have sent him a request for some additional information clarification in order to go further in the evaluation of his study and his results. And in addition to that, we have an ongoing continuous monitoring of scientific literature on sweeteners in order to be able to know when there are any new scientific data available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are a little bit short in time, so I would encourage you to ask very brief questions. And before going to the next panel, which is on the precautionary approach, I'm sure everything that has been said by EFSA is absolutely correct. Our concern, actually, of everybody who is here in this room, is whether it will take too long time, actually, until you come with scientifically evidence-based conclusion, and whether, meanwhile, there will be people which will suffer because of the exposure to aspartame if, for example, it has a negative effect on humans' health. But before going to the second section, let's see whether there are some questions to the experts and to those studies which have been presented. Any questions? Corinne, and then?
Merci, Antonyia. Oui, mes questions.
Thank you. I have a question for EFSA. Firstly, I understand your attitude to Professor Sofriti's research, but as I understand it, did you have the same questions about the previous reasons? And I wondered when the best, you had a question also about when the best practices, best laboratory practices were drawn up. And would you be able to tell us about the other studies that you looked at, and will they be published in review at the reading committee? If I'm thinking about the right studies, these studies were very controversial in the US, and they're still used to define the DGA, is that? To define the ADI, sorry, is that correct? Those are my questions.
Two more questions, and then we can give the word to our panelists. Are there any other questions? Okay, if there are no more questions, then floor is yours, and then we can go to the second panel.
Thank you, Ms. Lepage. Well, actually, regarding the process is rather simple. We have previous evaluation done by the SCF in 1984. And there are two possibilities to do a full reevaluation. First of all, we can undertake a full reevaluation if there are new data that are considered to justify such a reevaluation. Up to now, it has not been considered to be the case by the successive scientific committees who have been considering these new data. Then, the other possibility is within the framework of a systematic reevaluation of all permitted food additives, as defined in Regulation 257/2010 of March 2010. And we will undertake such a reevaluation in this framework, a full reevaluation of all sweeteners, including all permitted sweeteners, including aspartame. And that's the way it's actually done. So up to now, there has been no justification to reopen the full dossier and reevaluate completely, because the previous evaluation, the original evaluation done in 1994 by SCF, has been a very thorough one, and SCF has judged totally independently of any other evaluators throughout the world that the studies on which they base their ADI was correct. So, by principle, we are not reevaluating the. I will also answer to your question, but first I wanted to clarify this issue. Then, the SCF had access to the whole application study that was prepared by the applicant at that time, and therefore has had access to all the original studies made by CERL or commissioned by CERL, including the ones that were cited by Dr. Sofriti, the one from 73 and 74. But to my knowledge, there has been a lot more studies that have been considered than these ones. And the ones from 81 also have been considered.
Thank you very much. I have one more question actually to you, because it is from, as we have seen from the first presentation, there are more than 6,000 products which are with aspartame, and we have millions of people which are exposed to this. Obviously, if we have to wait for scientists to present some research, it may take years and years until you have the next study which is showing some evidence, and you will be able to evaluate or to have it in mind some outcomes in that particular study. And because it is from great importance and from public interest concerning public health, do you intend actually, you yourself, to undertake the lead in this and to work together with the scientific bodies and to have to use the opportunities of the Commission to actually to strengthen and to go for specific and targeted evidence-based study that will give you, meanwhile, the opportunity to have real evidence, scientifically based, instead of waiting the scientific world to provide you with such?
Monsieur, reposer ma question, pardonnez-moi.
I'll have to ask my question again because you didn't answer. I wondered whether these studies were published in reviews. You didn't answer me that. You didn't say which studies in 1980 qualified the definition of the ADI. As far as I understand, it was the manufacturer who commissioned these studies and not independent organisations. I'd like to have very specific answers to these two questions, please.
Répondre effectivement à ces questions.
So to answer these questions, it's quite normal that the studies are commissioned by the manufacturer and that these studies are not necessarily published. There are advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are that you have a comprehensive report from the studies, whereas when a study is published, you don't have access to all the data necessarily. Obviously, the disadvantage is that the data is confidential, so it can't be taken into account by unofficial assessors.
Ça, c'est un débat, je dirais, politique.
That's more of a political issue, I would say. That's what the rules say. And it's also for competition reasons. Where a firm has spent a great deal of money on study, it doesn't want its competitors to use the same studies to get authorization in other countries in Europe, for example. It's not an issue which concerns us directly, but it's a clarification. So to be very clear, these studies were not published. However, evaluation by scientific committees such as the ACF or the JECFA are considered to be equivalent to peer reviews, and they are much more critical and they use the most serious scientific opinions.
Vous les avez lus?
Alors, comme je l'ai indiqué, c'est le SCF qui a fait cette évaluation.
As I said, it's the ECF that made this assessment. SCF that made the assessment. And we have no reason to doubt the scientific quality of the opinions of the scientists, the SCF scientists who carried this out in 1984. We've evaluated it based on all the previous studies. You've said that the studies were correct, but you haven't read the studies, as you've said. Could you provide the studies? A response: I didn't say these were correct studies, but the SCF in 1984 judged that the studies were correct.
Excusez-moi, Madame la Présidente, j'ai oublié votre...
Madam Chair, I forgot to answer your question, please excuse me. Please, could you repeat it?
My question is, do you intend yourself to undertake and to use scientific approach towards studies that you could actually, invest in this, and you can start and asking for more data instead of waiting the scientists to come up?
Okay. Well, I think it's an important question. I will answer in two ways to this question. First of all, to clarify that it's not the mission of EFSA to commission studies, and it would anyway be a problem, because if we commission studies, we would not be in a position to interpret them at the end of the day. So that's one point, and we don't have enough budget for doing this anyway. However, what we are doing is actually, with this future opinion of the ANS panel, that will consider the results of the study by Safriti and al., and will also consider the hypothesis that has been put forward on methanol. The panel will see if there is any basis to ask for a new study on this, because, of course, up to now, there hasn't been any mechanism that has been considered as plausible to explain any carcinogenic effects. It's only the hypothesis of methanol that is brought forward by some scientists like Dr. Safriti. And of course, by doing this more in-depth evaluation on methanol, which is not isolated, by the way, because, for instance, the UK Committee on Toxicology, the COT, is also working on this issue. And there is also very wide ongoing evaluation of methanol by the American Environmental Protection Agency. So with this, if there are conclusions that there might be some uncertainties, then it's possible that at the end of the day, there will be a recommendation for further research, but now it's too early to say anything.
That's strange to say it's too early, given the fact that it's for such a long time. It's more than 20 years already, the concerns that are dating. But please, very quickly, your comment, and then we go to the second panel.
Desidero precisare.
I'd just like to specify that the experiments carried out in the 70s and the type of experiments carried out then, lastly on aspartame, that I mentioned in my presentation published in 1981, they were all conducted according to criteria, and those in the 70s as well, according to criteria. And this led the agencies, international agencies, to specify that this type of research must be carried out according to good laboratory practices, and so they set out generic good practices after. So these experiments don't have the minimum basic principles to be considered as adequate. We conducted our experiments on around 4,000 animals, and we published results on around 3,000 animals. And without discussion, with no doubt, we showed that aspartame is carcinogenic. Requests for data and information from agencies regarding that. The Ramazzini Institute sent, up till 2005, sent all the raw data to EFSA. That was around 900 pages of documentation. EFSA took these into consideration in just 1 week, or read them in just 1 week, and I think it's very difficult to carry out a qualitative evaluation. It won't be sufficient to change EFSA's opinion. I think they'll be sufficient to, well, there's a European directive, and this should lead countries to implement rules on good practices, and that should be mandatory. Thank you.
And furthermore, I would like to add that you referred to Ramazzini Institute study on the Swiss mice, but it was only 320, if I'm not mistaken, out of 4,000 mice. So this was not actually the major group of mice which had some problems.
800.
Yeah. Okay, so you could not say that because the Swiss mice has generally a problem with having some cancerogenic tumors, this refers to the whole group of mice, because it was the smallest group in the whole study. So that's actually not correct if you look at all the data that we have it. But I think we are turning to a scientific debate now. Probably it's good to go to the second panel, and then at the second Q&A section we will be able to clarify further. Now I'm giving the floor to my colleague Corinne Lepage.
Merci beaucoup, Antonyia. Donc, nous passons.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Now we'll move on to the second session, that is the precautionary principle. Should this be applied to aspartame? First, we'd like to have opinions from industry, so I'll pass the floor for 10 minutes to Emeritus Professor Renwick, who is president of the International Sweeteners Association. He's a representative of the International Sweeteners Association. You now have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I'm not president of ISA. I'm simply a scientific consultant for ISA, but I have been that for over 20 years. I would at this time like to point out that put a statement on record that I have been a member of a number of the regulatory advisory committees, such as the Committee on Toxicity, the Committee on Carcinogenicity in the UK, the EFSA panel on contaminants, and also the FAO-WHO Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives. At every single meeting at which a sweetener has been discussed, I have declared a personal and specific interest and been excluded from the discussion and the regulatory decisions. I have a large expertise on sweeteners, and that was the reason why, and my links with industry are the reason why I was excluded from contributing to decisions. And I'd like that to be noted and minuted, please, especially by the media if they're here, because I have not ever contributed to discussions and decisions on sweeteners. Right, aspartame. What I should be saying is a little bit repeats what's been said already by others, but I think it's so important that it's worth saying again. Go down, please. There is an enormous safety database on aspartame, and true, much of it is quite old, but of course it was evaluated comprehensively by the Food and Drug Administration prior to the approval of aspartame, and also there was the review on the procedure as well within America before aspartame was approved. And the database comprises the usual safety studies we've heard about: genotoxicity, short-term, long-term studies, carcinogenicity studies, and metabolism data. And last point, there are more data from studies in humans on aspartame than for any other approved food additive. It's an enormous and comprehensive database. Next slide, please. The acceptable daily intake set by the FCA, SCF, which has now been replaced by the EFSA, and also the same ADI set by JECFA and the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, is based on a no observed adverse effect level of 4,000 milligrams per kilogram body weight in the chronic rat studies. To derive the ADI, the acceptable daily intake, that no effect level in animals is divided by an uncertainty factor of 100. Next bullet, please. And this is the normal precautionary approach which is applied to derive the no AL for all food additives, and also for any other synthetic chemical added to food. Now, aspartame, as we've heard, is a very simple molecule compared with some of the others. It's a simple dipeptide that's hydrolyzed in the gastrointestinal tract into 3 components. All of those components occur naturally in the diet, and all of them can, if given at very high doses, produce toxicity. Paracelsus in the 15th century said everything is toxic, it is only the dose which makes something a toxin. And I think that is the thought that is missing in some of the discussions about safety in the current climate. Next slide, please. This just shows the levels of the 3 components, aspartic acid, phenylalanine, and methanol, that could be obtained from aspartame beverages. They're the little red boxes on the left-hand side of each sub-figure, compared with other dietary sources, such as, you probably can't see it, but chicken, etc., for meats for the 2 amino acids, and also fruit juices for methanol. And I shall come back to methanol in a minute. The next slide talks about the intake of aspartame by humans. There have been more studies on the intake of sweeteners, intense low-calorie sweeteners, than for any other food additives. There's a huge database. Again, we're not dealing with ignorance here. We're dealing with one of the best databases on intense sweetener intake. There are studies being performed in most countries around the world, including a number of European countries. So we have a very good database on actual intakes. In all cases, the average intakes for all groups is less than 10% of the ADI. And from different countries around the world, the high consumer intakes, 90th or 97.5th percentile intake, so in other words, the high end of the intake range is only about 10 milligrams per kilogram, which is well below the ADI of 40 milligrams per kilogram. So we have not only the precautionary approach in setting the ADI, but in reality, industry does not use so much aspartame that the ADI would be exceeded. The recent studies that we've heard about these, it's interesting to note that a single generation study used really heroic doses. Up to 10% of the diet was aspartame, fed every day throughout life. This is the normal sort of thing that's done in toxicity tests because we need to know what the compound is capable of doing. So this is not surprising. The second rat study is slightly surprising to me because I was surprised that the doses actually were so low in that second study. And then the mouse study used up to 3%. The findings are inconsistent with the data from the 1980s, the number of studies from the 1980s. The findings of the 2 rat studies are also inconsistent because mammary tumours were found in the second study but not in the first. And also they're inconsistent with the Ramazzini data for methanol toxicity, because with methanol toxicity there was a significant increase in ear duct tumours, which was not found in either of the 2 rat studies on aspartame. What was not mentioned, okay, can we go back please? What was not mentioned though in the presentation by Professor Safriti was there actually is an extensive human database which is growing all the time about the link between ingestion of aspartame or low-calorie sweetened products and human cancer. And there has been no link found between aspartame intake in humans, which of course is the species of greatest relevance, and cancer. The next slide, well, we've discussed briefly, we've heard a discussion of the Halderson paper by Professor Halderson, and he's acknowledged the fact that it is just an observational study, epidemiological observational study. I have a question for him, which I didn't have time to ask, which is this is based on the term and preterm. Was there actually any evidence of prematurity in the offspring, especially in those offspring born to the women who had low-calorie sweetener carbonated beverages. That wasn't in the paper, and it's impossible to dissect that information out. It's obviously an interesting study, but in fact the numbers of very small numbers in that high dose, high intake, and I wonder whether this pre-term, the date of term provided by the woman could be the variable which is subject to the socio-economic and educational status of the woman. Anyway, let's move on, because EFSA evaluated these studies. You really shouldn't listen to what I'm saying, because EFSA is the definitive organisation for food safety in Europe, and they've concluded that they do not give reason to reconsider. I want to move on now, though, to this issue of methanol and formaldehyde formation from the metabolism of aspartame, because both of these studies have implicated this as the mechanism. Next slide, please. Methanol is a metabolite of aspartame. It's released from aspartame metabolism in the GI tract and represents about 10% by weight of aspartame. So if high consumers have about 10 milligrams of aspartame per kilogram per day, a high consumer of aspartame would have about 1 milligram per kilogram of methanol per day. And methanol is metabolized via formaldehyde to formic acid, which is excreted in urine. There have been studies on aspartame and its production of methanol and the production of formic acid. Methanol is metabolized to formate in humans. A single dose of aspartame, 5 times the ADI, a huge dose, single dose, did not alter blood formate levels, produced a transient increase in formate, which you should expect. In other words, there is normally in the body endogenous levels of methanol and formate. Next slide, please. There are other dietary sources of methanol. Now, various studies have reported. The most important one is probably the methyl residues in pectin, which of course is an important ingredient of component of apples, fruits, peaches, etc., which is released as methanol, and this has been shown by a very thorough and comprehensive study using mass spectrometry that there is conversion of pectin to methanol, which is expired in humans on the breath, and that a kilogram of apples releases about 0.5 grams of methanol, or 8 milligrams per kilogram per day, which is 8 times the amount that you would get in a high consumer of aspartame. Also, there's endogenous formation of methanol. It's not totally a foreign chemical. Our bodies always contain methanol because it's formed endogenously, and its various estimates are around half a gram, 0.6 grams a day. In other words, perhaps 10 milligrams per kilogram per day from endogenous formation. So the next slide, please. Conclusion on methanol. Although aspartame is metabolized to methanol, it's really a minor dietary source of methanol, a minor dietary contributor to human exposure. I was interested to hear that the ANS panel is going to review methanol. I welcome that. The Committee on Toxicity have put on their website for information a review of methanol and its risks, dietary methanol and its risk to human health, and have concluded that exposure to methanol at the levels found in the diet and from aspartame will not result in adverse effects. So the conclusions reached by the authors of the 2 studies are really not supported by a biologically plausible mechanism. So there's no biologically plausible mechanism for the results. My last slide is just a summary of what I've said. I will just emphasise again point 2, the use of high dose in animal studies ensures that some hazard will be identified, but it's the precautionary approach that is used by regulatory bodies to set the ADI, which ensures there is negligible risk at human intakes. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Professeur Renwick, pour ces explications.
Thank you very much, Professor Renwick, for those explanations. I'll hand on now to Lynn Insel, co-chair of the CIAA expert group on food ingredients from the Confederation of the Food and Drink Industries of the European Union. 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Just to explain a little bit who we are as CIA, we represent the users of aspartame in the form of the food and drink manufacturing industry. We are made up of national federations and by our sector organisations, and we have a very diverse membership within this organisation, and we are made up of about 50% of SMEs, so those are just a few of our vital statistics. Next slide, please. The food and drink manufacturing industry has been using aspartame was approved during the first single market legislation in the Sweeteners Directive in 1994, and prior to that was used in a number of EU member states. So we have a lot of experience of the use of aspartame. During the time that it has been in use, a number of additional studies have been conducted and reviews conducted. I think in my almost 20 years in the food industry, it's the most studied of all the additives. And that is, speaking within our expert group, where we do represent a number of industry experts in the use of and science behind the food additives. So on the basis of the evidence so far, EFSA has concluded that consumption of aspartame is safe at the levels at which it is used by the industry. Next slide, please. Thank you. Aspartame is used very strictly in accordance with the legislation made currently under the specific directive on sweeteners 94/36, and this prescribes which food categories aspartame may be used in and the levels of use at which it may be used. This is in order to stay well within the ADI at the levels of use within the industry. Next slide, please. Consumer choice is paramount for the food and drink manufacturing industry. That is why we provide a very wide range of products to suit every taste, every pocket, every individual requirement. And aspartame, along with the other intense sweeteners that are also approved under the Sweeteners Directive, has allowed us to innovate, to provide products which are energy reduced and with no added sugar. These are actually requirements written into the legislation, so sweeteners may only be used in products which are defined as energy reduced. That must be 30% less than the standard product or with no added sugar. So this provides consumers with choice of lower calorie products. Next slide, please. Informing consumers is, of course, very important. As with all other food additives, aspartame has to be labelled. It must be labelled either by name or by its E number, which is E951. In fact, labelling of sweeteners is doubly labelled in the EU at the moment, so the product will be labelled as with sweeteners next to its designation. The term sweeteners or the aspartame will be in the ingredients list. And for the use of aspartame, we also have to give the information that it contains a source of phenylalanine. This is specifically for PKU sufferers. So I think just finally to conclude, consumers have the choice of products, and through consumer information, through labelling, have the choice that if they do not wish to consume products containing sweeteners or aspartame in particular, they can tell from the label and they are not obliged to consume them. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Merci infiniment, Madame Insal, pour cet esprit de synthèse.
Thank you very much for your concise presentation. Now, I'll give the floor to representatives from NGOs, starting with Dr. Laurent Chevalier from the Réseau Environnement Santé in charge of food issues. You have the floor.
D'abord, je vous remercie pour votre invitation. Effectivement, je suis le médecin Thank you very much. I'll try and be brief. I'm responsible for the RES, and I work in the university environment and in the clinics. And because of my office, I have also been involved in public awareness of bisphenol A, particularly in milk for babies. And as you know, that this was banned eventually in Europe, despite the EFSA opinion. Now, turning to aspartame specifically, I'd like to give you a risk-benefit analysis of this product. Two questions. Is it useful? Is it toxic? In other words, does aspartame give you all the safeguards that you have the right to expect? Is it useful? Well, many studies have shown that there's not much reason to take it to control your weight. For example, the Americans at the end of 2010 showed that a lot of people have in fact shown increased weight if they drink a lot of sugary drinks. And sweeteners can in fact lead to weight gain, although there are various compensation methods. Now, there are various studies which have shown this, and we have them available for you. I'd like to stress one important thing, which is that we don't have any factors, or hardly any in fact at all, regarding the interactions between sweeteners and medicines. In this respect, as the director of the liaison committees on food for various clinics, we decided unanimously to ban sweeteners from hospital food, and we have informed everybody about this. And this brings me to toxicity. I think that at the moment there are a lot of warning signs, a lot of uncertainty is out there, and we cannot continue to minimize such uncertainty. The EFSA has indeed examined two studies which were pointed up as being particularly important. With regard to the Ramazzini study, I don't want to go back over that again, except that we realize one thing now, which is that the protocol that Sofreti has been using does correspond to the JECFA latest requirements, which say that you have to be as close as possible to human exposure. Now, there's a lot of criticism of the Sofreti methodologies, but there's always a control group. And I was particularly surprised about what you said just now. I'm talking to EFSA now. In other words, the ADI currently, if you look at the AFSA and EFSA reports of 2002, is based on 3 studies of carcinogenicity. So there are 2 studies that you feel are in order. But that's just your interpretation because you haven't even read those studies. And the 3rd study of 1981 was financed by Reginamoto, and that was only on brain tumors and not all tumors. So these are studies, the 2 first studies were never published. They don't have a great deal of scientific value. And we are amazed that the EFSA has not challenged the ADI on the basis of those data. We are asking for all the studies to be evaluated with the same analysis method. I'd also like to react to a very important point that was made just now. It's, of course, the metabolites of aspartame which are a problem, particularly the amino acids and phenylalanine and methanol. It's true that there are sometimes too many amino acids, but the absorption into the intestine of amino acids and what happens to them in the body depends on the food environment. If it's included in the alimentary proteins, they won't behave in the same way as aspartame proteins. Now, I'm sorry, any European student in their first medical year would know that, and I think for methanol as well, there is a problem of bioavailability. I think that EFSA should demand that firms supply all their safety studies that they've carried out with regard to the toxicity data on phenylalanine and make these available to the public. Coming on to the Danish study now. Now, quite apart from the network that I run and our view on this, I'd like to give you an analysis from a doctor who receives women in a state of pregnancy with problems every week. We don't have a lot of studies, as you say, about sweeteners and their effect on pregnant women and the fetus, and you can't necessarily extrapolate from primates, but surely we could carry out studies on pregnant women and embryos. If it's true that the Danish study has limits, in other words, it's an observational study and we don't know the causes of preterm births. But it is nevertheless very relevant, and it does cover 60,000 women. It was published in Europe and it was published in the prestigious American Journal. Now, two aspects of the large number of women. The consumption of sweetened drinks doesn't lead to greater chance of medically induced preterm end of pregnancy. There is a constancy in these observations, whatever the mother, with what you omitted to say, a dose effect. Why didn't you talk about the dose effect? In other words, the more you consume, the greater the risk, and that is what happens, that's what matters for the fetus. And the other thing, with regard to this large sample, is that drinking these diet drinks associated with the aspartame brings with it so many disruptions of the markers, which has led to the doctors interrupting the pregnancies even and this was medically imposed, which meant that there were major disruptions observed by the doctors, because if the obstetrician decides to bring the fetus out early, there is a cessation of growth, there's a risk with the cardiac situation with regard to the fetus. That is a big risk. And wouldn't it be easier to stop pregnant women drinking diet drinks? EFSA, once again, you haven't mentioned the dose-effect relationship. This is one of the Bradford Hill criteria, which is used by epidemiologists to establish whether there is a cause-effect relationship. Quite apart from the consequences of suffering in the fetus, are we not going to find adverse effects on people who suffered from this kind of thing when they were fetuses? It's true this was an experimental study, but this could have ramifications later on. It's a bit like the Dittelbein effect, not to mention the problems associated with prematurity. A lack of action with regard to pregnant women could become a major problem, and it's not because we don't know quite what to do about this that we should shilly-shally. There have been lung cancers which have been induced. We don't know what the mechanism is. We should change the recommendations and we should show responsibility. And I hope that the experts of EFSA really realize the individual responsibility that they bear today. So, in summary, if extra studies, it is true, are necessary, then EFSA should allow full access to the studies on which the ADI was based and should recalculate the ADI, which is 30 years old now, and on the basis of scientific advances and current rules on risk assessment. EFSA must issue recommendations for consumption for young children and pregnant women and shoulder its responsibility to protect the health of Europeans and advise them on their health. I would recall that the European regulation bans the use of additives, including aspartame, in foods for newborn babies and very young babies. Why shouldn't the human embryo also benefit from that? The fetal period is a period of great vulnerability. The responsibility of those who evaluate risk within the European Commission and the European Parliament and member states of the European Union is now something which is clearly seen. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. Chevalier. Je passe.
Thank you, Dr. Chevalier. Now I'll pass the floor. You've raised very interesting points. We'll go back to that later, but now I'll pass the floor to Mrs. Katrien Renders, who represents a consumer group. You have 8 minutes.
I would like to remind that aspartame is only one of hundreds of food additives in our food. And these additives are regulated by regulation number 1333 from 2008. Why I want to remind you of that, that is because in this regulation we have the general conditions of use for food additives. And we, as a consumer organization, find extremely important those 4 conditions of use. So the first one is that there may not be a health safety concern. The second is that there has to be a reasonable technological need for the use of those additives. A third one is that they may not mislead the consumer, and there has to be a real benefit for the consumer. And we think this is a very positive thing that EFSA is re-evaluating this. The acceptable daily intake should protect every consumer that there is no exceedance of the ADI, and especially children are more vulnerable. We think that the legal maxima should protect really every consumer, so that the risk of exceedance has to be 0. In case of aspartame, the risk of exceedance of the current ADI is rather small. But I would like to more largen the debate also, because we see that for other additives like colors, there is a problem with this acceptable daily intake. EFSA has concluded for some colors that there is a problem with exceedance of the acceptable daily intake. Even when the intake is below the acceptable daily intake, there might be some problems with allergy and hypersensibility of additives. Aspartame is one of them, but I will not go further to this discussion. We have made a flyer to inform consumers about some health concerns about additives that you can see on the slide. We have done this with colleagues from Portugal, Spain, and Italy. So about the safety, we can conclude that we as a consumer organization want that each additive, that the safety of use of those additives in our plate are guaranteed. And we are very concerned also about the combination of additives, because we don't eat one additive at a time. Like for aspartame, it's often combined with acesulfame K in soft drinks. So we should like that the cocktail effect of those additives is more broadly studied than it is now. Can you give the next slide, please? Thank you. I have only showed an ingredient list to show the number of additives in one product, and when you combine all those food products, you have even more. Next slide, please. Then about the technological needs for aspartame, they do replace sugars in energy-reduced food, so we admit that it can be a useful tool to manage calorie intake, but we all know that it's not a miraculous solution for obesity. And when we look at other additives, because aspartame is only one of those few hundred, we know that benzoates, preservatives, can form, under certain circumstances, carcinogenic benzene, although alternatives are available on the market. So therefore, we should also like that the technological need and the alternatives are in every additive reviewed. And then the third general condition of use is very important for us too. It's that it cannot mislead the consumer. In the case of aspartame, it is clearly labeled that it goes about energy-reduced products. And therefore, the risk of misleading is not very great. But there are other additives, like colors, where we have some huge concerns about it. Sulfites are allowed in some minced meat products and can give a nice red color to the meat to give it a fresh aspect, but in fact it is not fresh meat. The same thing you have with some colors that should hide the lack of expensive ingredient. You can eat a nice red strawberry yogurt and you might think that it's full of plenty and healthy strawberries, but in fact it's just with colors. So we don't see the technological need of those products. And then the last general condition of use is that there has to be a real benefit for consumers. So I think it's very important to have a balance between the benefits for the consumer and the risks that the consumer take. Because often the risk is for the consumer and the benefit is for the producer. So we don't offer acceptance of risks when there is no real benefit for the consumers. And the use of additives should only be applied when there is no technological alternative. So as a conclusion, we are very much in favor of a continuous scientific research, also about the cocktail effect and about regular risk evaluation. In case of problems, we demand a very quick response of authorities, like when there is a concluded exceedance of the acceptable daily intake, for example, by children. And we think there's also a need for practical advice and information towards consumers. Also, and the vulnerable groups like children and pregnant women has to be considered there always to know what to do, what they have to do. We are for a ban of misleading additives like colors and basic foodstuffs. For aspartame, up till now we don't see enough reason to ask for a ban of aspartame, but we support further research. Thank you for your attention.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And so the last speaker, before we have some moments for debate, I give the floor now to the risk manager, Mr. Michael Fleu, head of unit in DG Sanko, of the unit for chemicals, contaminants, pesticides, etc., etc.
Vous avez la parole pour...
And you have 8 minutes.
Merci, Madame. Thank you first for this invitation and for organizing this hearing. It's a very good idea and bringing us all together. Unfortunately, now as the last speaker, I have to mind the time most, and unfortunately, I have to say many of the points which I want to raise were already forwarded by other colleagues, but therefore I might shorten my presentation a little bit. Let's start with the first slide to give you a brief overview of the regulatory history. It was already said that aspartame is at EU level regulated since 1994. This was the date when EU legislation harmonized the food additive on the various national markets with an ADI of 40 milligram per kilogram body weight. Currently, the substance is authorized in 33 different food categories. And it was also already said the substance has been various times reassessed by EFSA and by its predecessor, the Scientific Committee on Foodstuffs, in total 5 times. The last full re-evaluation was done in 2009. I want to raise one point which has not been brought to the attention fully today. This is the re-evaluation program, which we have only established in 2009, where the Commission has set up a program to re-evaluate all approved additives currently on the EU market. During this re-evaluation program, which was done in close consultation with EFSA, but also with 27 experts from member states, we have established a priority of the re-evaluation according to the latest. One of the elements was the latest full assessment done on a substance. And here, aspartame, nobody raised, none of the member states nor EFSA highlighted the need to bring forward a re-evaluation of aspartame. So it has currently, in comparison to other food additives in this program, a lower priority. Next one, also already said several times, on the 1st of February, we have asked EFSA for scientific and technical assistance. First, to look into the 2 studies which were presented today, but also to advise us on the need to revise whether these studies would trigger the need to revise the existing EFSA opinions. EFSA came forward with a statement on 28th of February, in which they, as we heard, in which they concluded that the information contained in these two studies do not give reason to reconsider their previous evaluations. I would like to stress as well that EFSA did this in close cooperation with the French agency ANSYS, which came only yesterday out with an opinion confirming more or less or being in line with the EFSA opinion. Also already partly said is what will EFSA do next? First of all, they will the EFSA panel this time will look more in detail in the Sofriti study. And for both studies, the Halderson and the Sofriti study, emphasis will be put on the implications of methanol, where some hypotheses were established in both studies for this substance. And EFSA itself will continue to monitor the scientific literature. What will we do next, the Commission? At this stage, as of today, we do not see a need for immediate regulatory action. The statement of EFSA does not include scientifically based concerns on the safety, and at this stage, we cannot take any preventive measure because, particularly also in the Halderson study, a hypothesis has been established and could not be proven by the existing data. This is confirmed by EFSA, but also by the author itself. So we have, at this stage, not the intention to take any immediate regulatory action. What we will do, we will, of course, wait first for the more comprehensive assessment by the EFSA panel, where they will look into the Sofriti study and in the methanol issue. We expect this by the end of the year. In the meantime, we will, as always, continue working closely together and monitor also the work carried out by the EFSA panel. We will inquire the possibility and the need for further studies. We need to first discuss this here, the findings of this statement also with member state experts. We will see with EFSA bilaterally and, if needed, also with the applicant. And as I said, we will not take immediate regulatory action, but once this new opinion of EFSA is available, we will, of course, reconsider our position. One of the position changes could be that we change the priorities in our re-evaluation program and bring forward the possible full evaluation of aspartame. If new scientific elements become known, we will act. Allow me one more comment. I think, as far as I understood, toxicological data are not subject to confidentiality. So we have recently adopted a legislation where it's clearly said that information which were used to establish to assess the toxicology are not bound by confidentiality. Merci, Madame.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for that information, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. Now, we've only got 5 minutes. If the interpreters are prepared to give us 5 or 10 extra minutes, I suggest we go to 3:05 maximum. Are there any questions? Yes, I have a question for the risk manager in the European Union. We realize that the EFSA and ANSYS are saying we should continue studies, there should be more studies. If they say that, then it means that EFSA and ANSYS have doubts. So I would note, sir, in your mind there is a doubt, and yet that shouldn't benefit to the consumer. It's more likely to benefit, in your mind, to the industrialist. Is that true? Do you give the benefit of the doubt to industry?
Dr Sofriti?
Non, Monsieur Anderson.
Non, il a aussi demandé. Oui. Ensuite, oui.
Dr. Sofriti, well, I'd just like to specify something with regard to the dose. That the rats treated with 20 milligrams per kilogram of body mass index showed an increase in mutations and leukemia. So if we have 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, that would be a dose which would be higher than the one in which we found an effect. With regard to the role of methanol can be important with regard to the leukemia effects. But there are also effects that we have come up against a significant increase in kidney and peripheral nerve cancer, which we didn't observe in the experiments that we conducted on both methanol and formaldehyde. So a possible correlation, this is speculation of course and would have to be further investigated for these two types of tumour, which are possibly due to the other two metabolites, phenylalanine and aspartame, potassium aspartame. I think that is something that needs to be taken into account. And the third aspect is that of the effects on humans. It's very difficult to assess the effects on humans if we consider that aspartame is present in 6,000 products. So every human being and child is exposed to aspartame. And the other question is the cocktail effect. In our projects, we are planning to look at the blend of aspartame and saccharin, which we do find in many of our drinks. That's one of our projects to investigate.
Dr. Alderson.
Yeah, I would like to just answer Professor Reinweg a bit, because I think we are sort of on the opposite side of opinion, and I think sort of his presentation highlights a bit sort of how problematic this field is, because, I mean, acknowledging the limitation of a study is not the same as saying that this is not a good study. And you said that there was sort of human studies had shown known carcinogenic effects, but they are observational again, so you can't discard an observational study during pregnancy, but highlight observational studies on cancer, which are more complex than sort of those over 9 months. And with respect to the methanols, I mean, the studies that you cited where they gave 34 milligrams per kilo of aspartame, they have been heavily criticized also by the US panel because they used poor methods for analyzing methanol. If you look at their graphs, they are actually optimizing their results, sort of giving 34 milligrams, because that's why the phenylalanine is going over the upper limit. So it's a dodgy paper, and it's quite a lot of dodgy results on methanol. It's poor data that we have. In my opinion, it's very poor. And you can pick the argument that you like on both sides. So that's my opinion. And when you say sort of you use upper adjectives like the comprehensive and the most thorough database, etc., most food additives are not that well extensively studied compared to many other foods. So we need more results, and sort of acknowledging the limitations, I think we could actually move the field a bit forward. But I'm not sort of, I think, yeah.
Hello, my name's Kate Trollope from EU Food Policy, and I've got a question for Mr. Kenningsveld. EFSA has been asked to assess the safety of Advantame for possible authorisation in the EU, and Advantame, of course, contains aspartame. You've stopped the clock on the application, and it looks as though the panel wasn't satisfied with some of the data. Can you explain if any of their concerns actually relate to any of the data on aspartame for that particular sweetener? Thank you.
Dernière question, Monsieur Renwick, et puis
Professor Rennick, last question, and then we'll go back to Mr. Fleu, and then to you, sir, to reply, and then you can ask the question. Go ahead.
Oui.
Firstly, if I could just correct that last question. Advantame is closely related to aspartame, but it's a totally different molecule. It's metabolized differently, so it is not the same. It's not the same molecule. I accept your study was huge, Dr. Alderson. I wasn't criticising the study. Really is the interpretation of the study. I'm slightly concerned that you said you look at the methanol data any way you like. I would accept that those old data on the kinetics of methanol after aspartame are limited. and they said there was nothing detectable using a not very sensitive method after 34 milligrams per kilogram. But they did detect it after 100 and 200, and only an idiot would suggest that there would be none after 34. I mean, no one is saying that there is no methanol produced after 34. It is really dose-response relationships which are critical. And the amount produced is relatively small compared with other dietary sources, and no one has really come back and argued about the Lindinger study, which showed that apples and pectin are major dietary sources of methanol and bigger dietary sources than aspartame. And if you propose banning aspartame during pregnancy, then you should ban fresh fruit, and that would just be ludicrous. Thank you.
Bon, Monsieur Flou, si vous voulez.
Mr. Flou, did you want to reply to the question? Mike, please.
I don't believe that we are taking the position of the industry. I mean, we have now we have received 2 studies. We have, according to our mission, we have asked EFSA to look at the study. EFSA is for us the EU risk assessor. EFSA is my point of reference. EFSA has said there is currently no, these studies are not conclusive, and they will look further into the studies. The panel is looking further into the studies, and I have said once this is done, we will consider carefully what we do next. But at this stage, I don't see a basis to take already now any actions. And another point is, I hear a lot here today. I'm not a toxicologist, but I hear a lot about a need for further studies and I have not really heard what type of studies we need. I also would like to clarify to the Danish colleague, I have no intention to criticize your study. I appreciate your study very much. It's 60,000 women over a period of 6 years. This is a huge database and a huge work, but this demonstrates as well that this is not something where you quickly develop a study and carry out a study, and by tomorrow we have a result. We have to be very careful here, but as of today, we will continue working with EFSA. We will continue working with member states and to see carefully about next steps. Merci.
Monsieur Königswald.
Mr. Königswald, thank you very much.
To what Mr. Chevalier said first, and then I will answer to Ms. Trollope. Mr. Chevalier said that we ask for more studies, and that ANSES asks for more studies, but I will not speak on behalf of ANSES, but regarding EFSA, we never asked in our statement for more studies. We never expressed more concerns and said that we would need more studies. So I think this should be clear. Then to answer to Ms. Trollope regarding Advantame, but no, this is totally unrelated with aspartame.
Monsieur Chevalier.
Mr. Chevalier, you have an answer now. Yes, I've understood. You have no doubts. At the moment, you have no doubts, firstly. Secondly, regarding bisphenol, EFSA also said that we don't need to review this, and bisphenol is forbidden in Europe for baby milk. What about aspartame? You have no doubts on consumption of aspartame by pregnant women on a daily basis, is that right? So just to be clear, I think we need to take the EFSA conclusions in that statement as they are. There are no doubts expressed here. That doesn't mean we have absolute certitude, it just means certainty. That just means that there are no doubts brought in by this study to bring doubt onto formal conclusions. So for you, what do you think is there's no doubt about the dose effect? Answer, please draw the conclusions, whatever conclusions you want to, but I think if you try to extrapolate more than is written down on the page, I think you risk a purely personal interpretation of the conclusions. I'm sorry, madam, but you didn't raise your hand earlier, and it's now 3:05. The interpreters have stayed a little longer, but I cannot extend it any longer now. So I'll have to conclude. It's been a very interesting debate, and I and Mrs. Parvanova have been very happy that we've organised this debate because some issues have been raised with great clarity. I've been very surprised, however, by this sort of role play going on between industry, which evaluates risk, and those who manage risks. From industry, we've heard that studies have been done, they've been sent to EFSA, EFSA has approved, and it's been then been re-evaluated. EFSA says, no, we haven't re-evaluated the studies, but we're happy with the studies that we've received. We have no particular problems with those. DG Sanko says, since EFSA says there's no problem with the studies we've been given, then there must be no problem. I'm not a scientist myself, therefore I can't judge, but I am an MEP and I represent European citizens here. So I'm here to apply the precautionary principle. And I think if we applied it in this case, I understand enough of the elements here to be able to take regulatory measures. I understand. However, I don't think it's normal that there's no independent evaluation, since the studies that have been looked at here have been criticised. And also don't understand that there aren't recommendations. I think there should be recommendations, at least for pregnant women, to say, well, there is some uncertainty there, that there are some doubts. Then whether or not they expose themselves to aspartame is up to them. As consumers, we've heard about the information on labels, the information we have to have on diet drink labels. However, we don't know how much we have to eat or drink to get to these recommended ADI daily levels on the labels. So the consumers don't have any information about the data we're talking about now. So we need to think about how we can inform consumers about the ADI and whether it's valid to set it at that rate. And we should also inform them that we do have some doubts in the case of pregnant women. I think the least we can do is to inform these people of the doubts that exist. I understand that we cannot take regulatory measures given the doubts, but we should apply the precautionary principle to inform people so that they know the doubts exist and can take measures.
Thank you very much. Actually, we could keep the status quo as it is so far, but anyway, this issue has been brought to the Parliament. Whether there will be precaution measures, whether there will be a special targeting group, which is the pregnant women, and to me this is a very vulnerable group and at risk, whether we will directly advise on them and EFSA is going to take the lead, or we leave it just to public awareness campaigns and BUEC and other AGOs to actually target these groups, it doesn't matter. Because one way or another way, it will go to the public and it will be widely spread as it is already going on. But to me, the main question is who is going to take the responsibility if something is going wrong? So we heard what is the opinion of EFSA, and I'm really very much concerned that still we keep kind of approach which is dividing between public health concerns and food safety. And when we talk about food all the time, we do not consider the health issue. Food is considered in this House and also by the Commission as something which does not have any relation to the health of human beings. And if we have a concern about public health, there is a scientific body in DG Sanko to which research could be actually requested and could be conducted. When we talk about food safety, it seems to me that there is no bureaucratic or administrative approach towards this scientific body, that such a research could be requested and conducted. And it is very surprising. I have completed my medical studies in 80s, 90s of the previous century, and even at that time we actually studied that food is closely related to the human health. And 30 years later, actually I'm very much surprised that still this knowledge has not come to the Commission. And I think that in terms of responsibility, it is utmost time that this should be reconsidered, and the Commission and EFSA should lead actually the campaign for, especially for those groups which might be exposed at risk, until we do not have a complete and clear evidence that it's safe for their, and aspartame especially, the case of aspartame, but it's not only aspartame, it's completely safe for their health and for the health of their babies. And meanwhile, I think EFSA should be a little bit more courageous and taking the leadership by looking at more studies, or even trying to inspire the scientific world to come up with those studies and to closely look at the details of these studies. And I think having just 2 weeks times to look at 900 pages, probably that's not enough. And I will be very glad to see much more commitment from EFSA towards this issue, but other food health concerns.
Merci, Antonyia. Écoutez, il me reste...
Thank you, Antonyia. I'd like to thank the speakers. We've had a very interesting debate here. I understand it may be frustrating that not everyone's had the chance to take the floor, but it's been a very interesting debate nonetheless. Thank you very much for the group administrators who've given us such great conditions to prepare this meeting, and the Chair kindly thanks the interpreters who've waited a little bit longer. Thank you very much.